If you've ever wanted to watch a professional editor do a live critique of the first page of a manuscript, you have come to the right place. Hi writers, I'm Cameron Montague Taylor, though you can call me C, and I'm a developmental editor of science fiction and fantasy novels. Today I'm going to be looking at the first page of a science fiction cyberpunk manuscript sent to me by one of my patrons, but before we dive into it, I'd like to get into a few caveats. First, bear in mind that, yes, while I do this for a living, this is also my opinion. Writing is an art and not an exact science, and while I will give you reasoning for things that I think or feel, it's absolutely possible that you might disagree with me, and that is totally fine. The purpose of doing this isn't to correct anyone, but rather to open up a discussion about what might be working, what might not be working, and how we can address those things in order to hook readers in and strengthen our writing. Second, remember that a living, breathing human being wrote this page. So while I absolutely encourage craft discussion in the comments, please treat the comments section like it's a critique circle and like the person who wrote this page is one of your critique partners. In other words, be constructive and be kind. Let's dive in. The story opens as follows. Children. Of course the sin had surrounded itself with children. The one-word opener is heavily stylized, and it doesn't always work. In this situation, I think it does, and I think it does for two reasons. First, because anytime there's any kind of threat to kids in question, the stakes immediately go bang. We tend to build an immediate connection to children and animals who are perceived as innocents, and as a result, and because of the framing, it feels like there's a flavor of implicit threat here, which I definitely find intriguing. It makes me want to read more. Secondly, by the end of that line, I come to understand that this is free and direct style that I'm reading. The point of view character is going, of course it surrounded itself with children. To me, it feels a little bit voicey, it has some judgment in it, and that hint of personality makes it even more successful for me. So, I like. Reading on. This sin wasn't those twins' mother, but it looked the part. It played with them, fussed over snack time, wiped away the boy's tears when he fell and skinned his knee. Capturing it here was out of the question. Ian couldn't use his synth nuller at a playground, and pulling a regular gun, while not as damaging to human bodies, was still far beyond an acceptable risk. Most sin trackers disagreed, as evidenced by the rising civilian death toll during tracking missions. Not on his watch. For me, that's quite strong. We don't really know what a sin is, but I'm not sure that that entirely matters, because that's the hook, that's the question. What is this thing, and why is Ian, our main character, so concerned about it being around children? We know it's not human. We know it's pretending to be one. Based on the genre, it's giving robot AI. We get also little hints of world-building context that get woven in quite quickly and easily so that, I'm digesting them, but I'm not even fully conscious of the fact that I'm digesting them. That synth nuller, for example, would presumably take this sin out in some way, but that it's even more dangerous to human beings than the bullet from a regular gun would be. Okay, that's interesting. Unexpected. We learn through context between the lines that Ian is a sin tracker, so his job is to track down these sin. We learn that tracking these sin is a big enough deal that apparently a rising civilian death toll is considered at least somewhat acceptable by the tracking community, not by Ian, which is a nice characterization detail on the backside of that world-building detail also. There's only one thing that's popping to my mind as potential constructive criticism as I'm reading this paragraph, and it is a nitpick, so take it with a grain of salt. But when I first read this, I found the transition between, of course the sin had surrounded itself with children, and this sin wasn't those twins' mother, but it looked the part, to be a little bit jarring. Because the question that popped into my head is, which twins? What twins? And that same question, or a different version of it, reappeared a couple sentences later, with capturing it here was out of the question because I thought, where? We get an almost immediate answer to that question with Ian couldn't use his synth nuller at a playground, and then suddenly we're like, we're in a playground. I got it. But that does give us a few sentences where we're kind of in wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey space. We don't quite know where we are, and the only details that we can picture are the really, really zoomed-in ones. The fussing and the wiping the tears and the skinned knee. These are great details, but they do sort of happen in a vacuum, and I think it's because we go from the general, children surrounded with children, and then zoom all the way in to those specific details, kind of skipping over a little bit of the setting and context in the middle. Again, I'm not sure this is really a problem, because after we zoom in, we pull back and suddenly we get this visual of the playground, and it happens before we're really even out of the first paragraph. So I would really only recommend making an alteration to this if the author kept combing and combing and combing this and going, why does it not feel quite right? In which case, I would suggest something like, after the line, of course the sin had surrounded itself with children, giving us an establishing shot of playground, zooming into those twins, and then zooming in again to this sin wasn't those twins' mother. That way we have the context to understand kind of where we are and who those twins are. Or rather, the fact that there are twins. Again, a nitpick, but one that might help guide the reader's eye into the scene a little bit more smoothly. Continuing on. Most sin trackers disagreed, as evidenced by the rising civilian death toll during tracking missions. Not on his watch. 20 years as a tracker, and he'd never harmed a person, a record he intended to keep. Nice little reinforcement of the fact that he doesn't consider sin to be people here. Double evidence by the fact that he refers to the sin as it. He fired off a quick text to Quentin, letting his husband know he'd be late for dinner, then turned off his Nexus. The sin's dot in the tracking app would have been welcome, but he couldn't afford an incoming call distracting him. Once it had been a simple matter to block communications while keeping the tracking app active, but now that most trackers had migrated to the implant-enhanced model, the bracelet Ian preferred had gone into planned obsolescence, and the first thing they did was remove useful features. Okay, in chronological order, the quick text to Quentin letting his husband know, really deftly giving us an introduction to Quentin, and also to the fact that Ian's married, he has someone important in his life, someone who's waiting back home. Also a nice seamless introduction to the idea of the Nexus. It's giving kind of advanced cell phone technology. It's like tracking app and incoming call. I'm following everything thus far, and this feels like good context, preparation as we're about to enter into what feels like a chase scene. Then we get into the exposition. Once it had been a simple matter to block communications while keeping the app active, and how Ian used to like the bracelet but planned obsolescence, etc. This is a fun characterization detail, and I get the impression that Ian is kind of a little bit of like a curmudgeon when it comes to technology, and like, man, do I feel that. But I think this piece of exposition is probably a little bit extra. While it feels important, I don't think it's important enough to take up this first page real estate, and I would recommend moving it a little bit later. It doesn't seem like it's going to be immediately relevant in the next 4 or 5 paragraphs. It kind of feels like a little bit of a distraction, because the sin's dot in the tracking app would have been welcome, but he couldn't afford an incoming call distracting him. That feels like rising tension, because he's choosing now to go in blind in a way for this chase. We think, oh, that's a decision that might have repercussions. World building detail about the bracelet that follows, though, that feels like an aside. And it's an aside that would work a lot better if it weren't on the very first page. So again, great detail. Save that detail. Just bump it later. Because then next we get no matter. As long as he maintained a visual, he'd be okay to follow. Great. Already tells us he's going to have a terrible time maintaining that visual, and I'm excited for it. There were 9 children, including the 2 the sin had brought with it, and 6 adults in the park. One adult was more concerned with his Nexus than with his child. Another 2 held hands but never took their eyes off their little girl. Across the street to his left, a news drone hovered above a building that had been consumed in a fire the day before. These people treated the sin in their midst as if it were one of their own. Little surprise when the things had been built to resemble humans so closely they passed urine tests. Nothing short of invasive surgery revealed them for what they were. What possible defense could a human have against that? Ian himself had no idea how often he'd passed one in the street without suspecting a thing. Tracking codes were his only way of telling. This is more strong context. Ian's giving us the layout of the park, and we get the impression that he's giving us this layout because he's looking at obstacles, impediments, and potential casualties. Then he uses that to extrapolate, telling us a little bit more about this sin and why these people are so casually hanging out with it. And it's because they cannot tell that this thing is not, in fact, a human. By this point, the one thing that's itching me is the why. Now, to be clear, I don't need to know every single detail about why Ian is tracking this specific sin. But I do think I'm hankering for a little bit more of a hint. I'm getting the context that this thing is somehow dangerous, masquerading, but I don't quite have any evidence for that. What I'm kind of missing, I think, is the sense of the stakes. Because Ian is hinting that this sin is potentially dangerous, that it has the ability to masquerade as a human. But right now, all I've seen that sin do is be motherly and caring towards these children. I think I need a stronger hint from Ian about what the danger is here. There were 9 children, including the 2 the sin had brought with it, and 6 adults in the park. 1 adult was more concerned with his nexus than his child. Another 2 held hands but never took their eyes off their little girl. Right there, before we go across the street to the left to see the drone, in that spot, Ian has the opportunity for one short, quick, punchy sentence telling us what he's afraid of that they are unaware of. These civilians have no idea that the mother next to them is a ticking time bomb or a mass murderer or I don't know. He doesn't even need to get hyper specific with it, but a single look at what Ian fears would happen if he didn't intervene and chase this sin, even though there's the threat of collateral damage and that collateral damage includes children, that hint would take the stakes that the author is trying to establish and really sharpen them to a super fine point. Is this a nitpick? Absolutely, you betcha it is. Overall, I think this page is quite strong, and if I had picked up this book off a shelf in the library, I would absolutely keep reading. So these points that I'm trying to make aren't in the service of saying this was a mistake, but rather these are the comments that I would leave in the margins saying, all right, this is already super strong, but here's how if you took 800 grit sandpaper, you could get it even smoother and even sharper. Overall, though, what this author is doing very well is they're establishing setting, they're establishing conflict, they're establishing world building details, they're establishing character, and they're priming the reader to ask a bunch of important and interesting questions about what's going to happen next, all while winding up the tension and saying, hey, we're about to get into an action scene and stuff's about to get weird. And for me, all of those things taken together promise me that there's a story in here that's about to unfold, and I want to know what it is. I hope you found this breakdown of an opening page at least somewhat helpful. If you did, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Of course, I would like to extend another big thank you to all of my patrons for their support, and I look forward to seeing you next time.